time of question and answers, and then maybe a more informal time where those of you who are interested can come up and talk with him a little more questions that are more specific. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Phillip Johnson.
Is this microphone in the right position? Or?
That microphone's a light.
That's a light. All right. Yeah, we've got the camera, but in 1959, a great convocation was held at the University of Chicago to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's masterpiece, The Origin of Species. The Origin was a book which enormously changed humanity's conception of its place in the universe. Some would say irrevocably, others would say for a long time. But perhaps there'll be another change. But there was no sense that there could be another change in 1959 when all of the leading evolutionary biologists of the world gathered at the University of Chicago to celebrate the great triumph of Darwin's theory. It was the kind of conference we academics like to have, where people present papers and they have a lot of drinks and eat some good meals, and they tell each other how good the papers are. And this was a particularly self-congratulatory conference because it was seen as marking the total vindication and triumph of the Darwinian theory and its worldview. The most honored speaker on this occasion was Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, who really took the lead in debating the question on Darwin's behalf at the time immediately after the publication of The Origin of Species. Julian Huxley, the grandson, as of 1959, was a distinguished biologist and also world statesman and philosopher, one of the principal founders of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and author of Religion Without Revelation, a leading cultural guru, we would say today, as well as statesman and scientist. Now, Huxley's triumphalism was unrestrained on this occasion. I'm just going to read you some excerpts from what he said at this convocation of scientists as a keynote speaker. He said, "Future historians will perhaps take this centennial week as epitomizing an important, critical period in the history of this Earth of ours. The period when the process of evolution, in the person of inquiring man, began to be truly conscious of itself." Let's come on right in, yeah. This is one of the first public occasions on which it has been frankly faced that all aspects of reality are subject to evolution, from atoms and stars to fish and flowers, from fish and flowers to human societies and values. Indeed, that all reality is a single process of evolution. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need nor room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. Finally, the evolutionary vision is enabling us to discern, however incompletely, the lineaments of the new religion that we can be sure will arise to serve the needs of the coming era. Now, these were not offhand words or casual statements of personal opinion on a minor occasion. This was seen as the statement of the spirit of the conference by, as I say, its most honored speaker among many very distinguished people. But why did Huxley insist that all reality is a single process of evolution? Why did he insist that evolution excludes creation? No, the earth was not created, it evolved, he said. Why are these two mutually exclusive? Understanding these points begins with a clear definition of terms. And I will say that one of the things one can learn from studying this subject that can be of use to you in other subjects, in general the debate or discourse about any issue of politics or religion or anything, is the importance of clear definition of terms. If the terms are vague, then he who can manipulate the definitions controls the discussion. Now let's us get the terms clear so nobody can do any manipulating. Now what is creation? Let's start with that. Now the term creation, and especially creationism, has been used in the public realm, in newspapers, media, science textbooks, popular science treatments, public television programs, you name it, in a very special sense. A creationist, in this sense, is a biblical literalist, a person who takes the opening chapters of the book of Genesis literally as imposing an earth which is very young, approximately 6,000 or no more than 10,000 years old. And creation occurred in 6 literal 24-hour days in a 7-week period. Creationism, as I say, used in this sense, then is often linked with the term creation science, which is a movement which aims to give scientific support to the young Earth sudden creation position by making arguments of analyzing the scientific evidence, fossils, and experimental evidence, and whatnot. But this is a very specialized definition of creation and creationism. Taken more generally, a creationist is not necessarily someone who has a belief that the Earth is young, or someone that has a position about the Bible, takes it literally or figuratively, or cares about it at all. A creationist is a person who believes in creation. What makes creation? Well, creation can be sudden or it can be gradual. It can take a few thousand years or a few minutes, or it could take a few billion years. There's no reason why creation cannot occur by a gradual process over, let us say, 4.6 billion years, which is the officially recognized estimate of the age of the Earth. Creation could be very gradual, and it would still be creation if the process of bringing the Earth and its living creatures into form were a process which was initiated and guided by an intelligence for a purpose. So that the really defining character of the term creation, properly understood, is quite independent of these questions about how long it took or how gradual it was. To put it in short, there's no inherent reason why God could not use a gradual process over billions of years of developing one kind of thing out of another, and we could call that creation. Now, in that sense, of course, there is no contradiction between the term creation and evolution, or it sounds like there is no contradiction, because many people, when they use the term evolution, just mean a long, drawn-out process in which one thing is developed out of another. And if matters could be left there, there would be no inherent contradiction between creation and evolution, and Julian Huxley could have said the Earth was created and it also evolved. But he didn't say that, and the reason that he didn't say it is that he was using evolution in the sense in which the scientific community normally uses it. In the ordinary usage, in the usage which is universal throughout the evolutionary biology community, evolution does not mean just a gradual process of development. It means an unguided process, a materialistic process, a fully naturalistic process, in which the elements in the process are strictly material. To simplify somewhat, one has the random elements, random mutations, random genetic changes, random changes of some sort, which are not guided. The new material comes into the process, the innovations, the first start of new things like wings and eyes and so on, comes in not because the creature wants them or needs them or something outside the process guides them, says this is the right thing for now, I'm trying to get things to go in a certain way. Let's have a certain kind of mutation. The mutations arise randomly and are in no direction whatsoever. And then such guidance as the process has is supplied only by natural selection, the survival of the fittest, which again simply means that some things live longer than others and have more children, more offspring than others. So if one has something that can be called an advantage, and it allows the organism possessing that advantage to produce more offspring than other organisms in the population, gradually over time, that advantage is passed down to the offspring in generation after generation who out-reproduce the others in the population, and so eventually you have the characteristic pass through the population, and then more random changes, mutations can arrive. And the theory is that by essentially this process, there can be a buildup of all of the complicated organs and systems which make a complex living creature such as ourselves. Now, the theory of evolution so understood, as I say, is a completely unguided process, which because of these elements does not require or permit the participation of anything outside of the natural world. And that is why it is said that evolution excludes creation. That's why Julian Huxley said that, because if it were guided from outside, if the creator did anything to guide it, it wouldn't be evolution. Now, the theory of biological evolution exists primarily to explain two features of the living world. The first I've already made some reference to. That's complexity. All of the living creatures that we're familiar with, plants and flowers and trees and butterflies and bats and horses and monkeys and human beings and fish and whales and so on, are extremely complex aggregations of extremely complex aggregations. But even the simplest bacterial cell, the so-called prokaryote bacterial cell, is a masterpiece of miniaturized complexity that makes the products of human ingenuity and engineering look rather low-tech in comparison. And the problem that science faced in Darwin's time was how could these extremely complex organisms, something like a very intricately crafted Swiss watch, let us say, even in the simplest form of organism, come about without someone to design, to put them together, without a pre-existing intelligence. And that was one problem. How do you get complexity, complex design, without the designer? Yes, why don't you come and make yourself comfortable and sit down. There's no need to stay there. Now, the second type of problem to explain was relationship. Living organisms seem to be put together in groups, and in groups within groups. At the lower level groups, we have species and genera, like dogs. A species of dogs are a species. One gets up from that somewhat more inclusive groups, genera and families, orders, classes, and so on up the hierarchy. So that we have, for example, we have the dogs, the whales, the horses, and human beings within a group called mammals. We have mammals within a larger group called vertebrates, which are within a still larger group called animals, which contains many other groups, such as insects, which again have many groups within that general characterization. The groups within groups arrangement of the natural hierarchy of nature. And the question is, why do these groups exist? Why are, to put it another way, human beings so very much like chimpanzees in their appearance, somewhat less like rabbits, still less like snakes, and yet much more like snakes than they are like trees? What explains the existence of this pattern in nature in which there are common features common to all living systems. They have basically the same biochemical setup, a common genetic code, and a DNA in origin. Well, the theory of evolution, as Darwin proposed it, and has been carried forward into the present world as neo-Darwinism, explained these two features with a tremendous grand concept, and a unified theory that's really rather simple to explain and understand in its essential, complex as it may be in its details, and which had tremendous appeal to the scientific and intellectual imagination. The explanation was that all of this tremendous complexity and diversity of related organisms had been built up by the simple process of parental descent that we see operating in the present-day world. Grandparents give birth to parents, parents give birth to children, to grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so on down. If you extend this process through millions of years, Darwin thought, you can perhaps get a buildup of the small changes that might differentiate a parent from a child into the kind of big changes that differentiate one kind of organism from another. This was the process of descent with modification. As I say, it's simply the system of reproduction by the ordinary biological means which we see in the present-day world carried out to large. And that system, if it is true, could explain the relationship problem, the groups within groups. Because according to this idea, all living things possess the common ancestor somewhere back in the microscopic world of bacterium. And that the groups which were most like each other had a relatively recent common ancestor, and the ones that were a bit less like each other had a more distant common ancestor. So that the theory would go, humans and chimpanzees are relatively like each other because they have a relatively recent ancestor. All mammals have a common ancestor that's more distant. All vertebrates a still more distant common ancestor, and so on back. And that would explain this pattern of relationships. Now, the theory meant to explain also the complexity, the complex adaptive features, wings and eyes and hearts and brains and livers and fingers and toes, and all these things that are so tremendously hard to design and make, even in rudimentary fashion, by our relatively advanced science of today. And how is it all done without, brains and techniques to do it? Well, here, of course, is where we bring natural selection into the picture. The theory said that as small changes occurred by random methods and naturally, certain organisms would possess an advantage in the form of some inheritable characteristic which they could pass on to their descendants, and if those descendants then produced more descendants than something else, they would gradually come to dominate the population, and they would crowd out anything not so advantaged. And by this system of continual improvements of a random nature happening to occur, the preservation and spreading of them through natural selection, one could, so it was hypothesized, build up these extremely complex systems. And one could explain common features that did not seem to be the product of common descent. One example that's often given of this is in Australia you have marsupial creatures, that carry their young in a pouch. We have the kangaroo, but they have an extinct marsupial wolf, which is very like, it looks an awful lot like the wolves of North America. It's developed the same pattern, but it doesn't thought that they inherited the same sets of legs and so on, because the reproductive systems are thought to be more fundamental. And so it's assumed that they split off before they evolved all those common legs and features. And so those are the result, it was thought, of convergent evolution through natural selection, that was a design that was good, and so natural selection produced it more than once. So one can explain all these features by this theory. It's a beautiful theory. And if you're looking for that kind of thing, it's just a wonderful theory because, as Darwin thought of it, it's completely scientific. And by scientific, he meant it makes no room in it whatsoever for any miracles. At no point in the system does God ever step in and say, I'm going to help this along. It's not going fast enough. It's not going in the right direction. No, everything can happen without anything. from outside. And in Darwin's time, as today, this was thought to be essential for a truly scientific explanation. So the idea was tremendously pleasing to people who wanted to have that kind of complete explanation. It was very attractive to the imagination. And it is because of this factor that Darwin was always very, very resistant to suggestions, which he got all the time from other people, and especially including Thomas Henry Huxley, his bulldog, that if he wanted to make his theory consistent with the evidence, he better allow some jumps. I'll tell you why he had to do that in a minute, but you see, you better allow one thing to turn into another pretty suddenly, and with just a big leap instead of this tiny step-by-step process. Darwin said, no, that would be a miracle if I allowed that. If I allowed something new to appear all at once, it would seem to need, you see, some miraculous force to guide it, to make everything come out right. Whereas if it happens in tiny, tiny increments, maybe it doesn't, or certainly it doesn't. And so I'm going to stick to this system, even if that means that I have to do some pretty fast footwork in dealing with some objections that are made by the theory that would be much easier to deal with if I accepted Mr. Huxley's suggestion and allowed for some jumps. Huxley always put it in Latin, some saltus, which just means jumps in Latin. So it was going to be a very gradual system. Now, you see the system so maintained. Now we can really begin to see why this is a completely naturalistic system and why, as evolution, it can't be creation also. Because there's nothing for the creator to do. And that's why Huxley said that the evolutionary consciousness, the evolutionary understanding, it provides neither need nor room for the supernatural. It didn't need the supernatural, and the supernatural was never involved, only the natural was. And so it was a process unguided by anything outside of itself. And the same point was put in a great summary by George Gaylord Simpson, the Harvard paleontologist who was one of the main founders of the modern neo-Darwinistic synthesis in the 1930s. In his book, The Meaning of Evolution, he explained it as follows. He said, although many details remain to be worked out, it is already evident that all the objective phenomena of the history of life can be explained by purely naturalistic, or in a proper sense of the sometimes abused word, materialistic factors. They are readily explicable on the basis of differential reproduction in populations. That's natural selection, survival of the fittest. And the mainly random interplay of the known processes of heredity. That's random mutation. And then Simpson closes with the punchline. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. That is what follows. And the position, this is a philosophical position which goes by different names: scientific naturalism, scientific materialism, evolutionism. And it says that you may believe that God exists if you like, but existing is the only thing that God ever did. Because God never, what God emphatically did not ever do is any creating. That was all done, it operated perfectly well without God. So you might as well forget about the fellow who has never found any useful employment. That's the theory. And that's the consequence of the theory, and that's why Huxley saw that it would have to be the basis for all future religion, because it's knocked out the previous religion, if it's true. But there's the question, is it true? Now we certainly see that we have a reason at this point why people other than professional evolutionary biologists want to ask this question, is it true? Because you see, a theory that explains that much and that makes that great a claim on us is something that has a great impact on the ordinary person and not just on the professional biologist. So if professionals from this field are saying, we have something that tells you that you are alone in the universe here, it is a meaningless universe that cares nothing for you. If you are to have any values, you will have to make them up yourself, because there's nobody up there who likes you, or dislikes you, for that matter. There's nobody up there who cares about you at all, because there's nobody up there. If that is what is the message that is coming out of evolutionary biology, then people are entitled to ask the question, how do we know whether this is true? And that's the question that I decided to put when I first took up this work that I'm doing 3 years ago when I was on sabbatical in England, and I really read up on the subject. I wanted to ask, is all of this true? Or specifically, I didn't want to ask, is the Earth 4.6 billion years old? You know, that didn't seem to me to be the main question. And I didn't even want to ask, was there a gradual process of development, that one thing was made out of another? That didn't seem to me to be the important question. The important question to me was, does science really know, as it claims to know, of purely material natural processes which are capable of making the kinds of changes and innovations that are needed? It has to, in pre-biological evolution, produce the first living organism out of non-living chemicals, and then it's got to take that replicating molecule or bacterial cell or whatever you want to imagine it to be, all the way up into the many diverse and complex life forms that there are today. It has to be able to evolve, well, let us say the eye, a very complex mechanism which requires complex neural mechanisms behind it in order to be of any use. So you have to be able to make decisions based on what you see. And it has to have been able to produce the eye over 40 different times by this purely naturalistic process of evolution, because there are that many distinct types of eyes, according to the evolutionary biologists in the animal kingdom. And that's just one example. There are many different types of wings, many different types of, you name it, that are all these extremely complex innovations. And the question is, do they really know of a process that's capable of doing all this, or is it a claim resting on inadequate evidence? And that's what I wanted to test. And that's really the subject of my book, Darwin on Trial. Now, naturally, in this lecture, I can't go over all the evidence that's in the book. I can only give you a flavor of the kind of thinking, the kind of approach that is in the book. I have 2 chapters on 2 and 3 on natural selection and mutation, in which I explore the fact, really, that the natural selection process has been shown to produce only very limited variations within a population, and cyclical variations, in fact, rather than fundamental directional changes of the kind that change one thing into another. The most famous demonstration of the power of natural selection that's been used as proof of the whole theory in textbooks for many years is the peppered moth observations that all of you have taken any biology at all have heard about, I'm sure, that, to put it very briefly, in an area of England contained a population of peppered moths, some of which were dark and some of which were light-colored. And when the trees became darkened due to industrial smoke, the dark moths predominated. There were more dark moths than light moths. And then when the air was cleaned up, and so the trees got lighter again, you had a resurgence of the light moth population. Well, that certainly shows one can have variations in the numbers, but as anyone can see looking at it, it doesn't tell you much about how moths, trees, and scientific observers got there in the first place. And in fact, both light and dark-colored moths were present in the population all the way along. The selective breeding experiments, which are used to demonstrate, which we want to make Darwin's main arguments, and still are, by breeding you can get a lot of different kinds of dogs, as one sees, although they're all within one biological species. While within plants, one can make members of separate breeding communities, apparently, and in this case cross the most commonly used definition of species boundary, one still gets variation only strictly within limited boundaries. And the limits on the variation are not due to the fact that you run out of time. That's the important thing. It isn't that you run out of time, it's that because you run out of variation before you run out of time. And thus the reason we do not get dogs as big as elephants, much less dogs turn into elephants, is not that we don't have enough time, but that there isn't that much variability in the dog genome, because the dogs stop getting bigger long before they're reaching the elephant size. So the artificial selection evidence really shows the limitations rather than the power of the process. That's chapters 2 and 3. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 deal primarily with the fossil evidence. Here I ask the reader to consider what anyone would have predicted the fossil evidence to show if the theory were true. If you're familiar with the original, with Darwin's Origin of Species, you know that when he deals with this subject, he explains away negative evidence. He says, I admit the fossils are dead against me, but it's not fatal. The fossils do not show any transitions, gradual step-by-step transitions of one thing into another, but that's just because they're snapshots of the past. There are many gaps in the fossil record. It was all going on, but it just never got recorded. And 130 years later, after very diligent search to validate the theory, it is commonly stated in the paleontological literature now that the outstanding fact of the fossil record is, on the one hand, its sudden appearance. New kinds of creatures appear from time to time in different age rocks, but they appear suddenly. And then, more importantly, they persist fundamentally unchanged. This is stasis in the jargon of the trade, throughout their time on Earth. I deal with the molecular evidence in chapter 7, which is a bit more complicated subject. I won't try to cover it tonight, but which, in my opinion, fairly analyzed, shows confirmation of the pattern of relationship, which we already saw to exist. Remember, relationship was the one thing other than complexity that needed to be explained, but does nothing at all to help with the question of whether natural selection has the kind of creative power that is required to make the system work. And then in chapter 8, I deal with the chemical evidence of pre-biological evolution, the first origin of life. Now, one can build up quite a negative case by going through evidence like that, and other people have done that before me. And in a way, it's almost not really the point. Because someone who wants to defend the theory will just simply say, oh, well, every theory has its problems. Science has solved many problems before. We can solve these. And so merely by showing that we haven't solved a whole lot of problems, we haven't really defeated the theory. And at this point, I want to go into what I think is really the crucial question. That one has to know something about the evidence to evaluate, but it is really much more important than simply lining up the evidence on one side or the other or listing problems with the theory. It's really the way that the evolutionary biology community thinks about the theory. Now, I'll illustrate this by telling you the problem that I kept running into when I was trying to raise questions. I'm a professor at one of the world's great science universities, so I'm in the School of Law. I'm not in one of the science faculties, but I have lots of friends and colleagues who are very distinguished scientists in this evolutionary biology and other subjects. And others who aren't really in that field but think they know a lot about it. And so I would, with any group, I'd come and I'd say, well, look, I want to know, is this really true? Look at this problem. Look at that problem. And what I would find is, instead of getting the kind of answers that satisfied me, I'd get a response like this. Well, what's your alternative? And I'd say, well, let's say, how about God created? That's outside of science. Oh. Well, how about we don't know the answer? You don't know how science works. It turns out that the rules of the game, this is my chapter 9, really, the rules of the game, the rules of science, I tell you that in the first place, you aren't allowed to consider anything outside of science, that the supernatural is just another way, I guess, of saying something outside of nature, outside of the natural, and science can deal only with the natural and the material. Now, that's perfectly all right to say that science can deal only with the natural and the material. But on the other hand, science aims to answer the question of how we came to be here. And if it tells us the truth about how we came to be here, and if it tells us that we came to be here without anything out of nature or outside of matter being involved in it, it's dealt with something outside of science, hasn't it? It's dealt with the non-material and the non-natural, essentially by saying that it's been established that they did not have any effect. And that was one thing that bothered me. How can you deal with something by saying you're not going to deal with it, and then deal with it and answer the question while take it into account? But the second part of this was even more impressive, you see, because it turned out that one cannot argue, in accordance with the rules of the scientific game, that Darwinism is false. What one can do is improve it with a better theory. But since it's the scientific paradigm, it's in place, and it gives what is considered to be a reasonably plausible answer that's accepted by a lot of people, it stands as true until and unless it's improved. And of course, it can only be improved by something that meets the philosophical rules of the game, something natural, something material. And so you can see the rules build in the answer. If you can't consider the non-material and the non-natural, and if you've got to have an answer, and you can't throw out the answer without having something else that's material and natural to replace it, well then of course everything was created by the natural and the material. And indeed, I found it extremely difficult even to get anyone to focus on the question of, can natural selection really do all of this? Well, it's the accepted scientific answer. What's your alternative? You don't know how science works. Now, those kinds of replies, far from satisfying me, made me think that this is exactly how I see people argue when they're trying to avoid knowing something rather than trying to find out something. And clearly, anyone that can set rules of argument that are that powerful can control the outcome. And so that's what we have here. And I became aware that there were a great many people who did not know and did not care about the difference between what they assumed at the beginning of the argument and what they got out at the other end as conclusion. They would say, we have established that non-material and non-natural factors can do all of this, therefore there is no influence outside of the natural. And when you said, well, I want to see whether that's true, you say, okay, but you've got to play by the rules of the game where we assume that only natural and material factors can do anything, and that whatever your plausible answer is can do it. Now, that experience is what I recount in Darwin on Trial. And it leads me to the conclusion that we have to think at this point in our history about two great experiences that we've had in our times, in our century, and in my lifetime, and perhaps a bit longer, both relating to that wonderful thing, science. And I think we've discovered two things by experience through this century. First, science is a wonderful thing. It can discover a whole lot, and it can do a lot of things. I mean, we all see this. I mean, here there is this video camera, which is recording. There's this microphone here. There are these electric lights. There's the spaceship that goes up and goes to the moon. And there's those wonderful bombs that blow us up in our cities. And there are, which are impressive, dangerous as they may be, are certainly impressive technological accomplishments. So, of course, everybody thinks science has got to be credible. It's really got to be true, basically, or it couldn't do all those wonderful things. But then there's the second lesson, which is equally important. That in a culture which trusts something, you'll find that the untrustworthy tries to look like the thing that everybody trusts. See, if everybody believes in a particular kind of religion, you see, then if you're a con man, what you'll do is you'll pose as a bishop of that religion. And say, and if you can get people to accept you, you'll be able to illegitimately borrow the credibility that religion has. Well, if the religion of the community is science, that is to say, if the thing that they really believe in, because I mean, I've seen these rockets, is science, and you want to get them to believe something that isn't very well founded, what will you do? Well, it's obvious. You will tell them it's science. And you will, and if you can get yourself accepted as science, then by the people that make those rockets and so on, then you have a tremendous ability to win trust and credibility that may get people not to examine the bona fides of your argument as carefully as they otherwise might. Now, in our century, look at the examples we have seen of this that have been so powerful and so persuasive. Marxism, the science of society, scientific. Indeed, that was always the great appeal of Marxist socialism, of some other types of socialism as well. That this is science applied to society. And so if you accept the scientific method, the scientific outlook, you will accept Marxism. Now today we see this science in shambles. We see it collapsing all over the globe. And I think it's almost hard to imagine that in the 1920s and 30s, most intellectuals throughout the world accepted the scientific pretensions and claims of Marxism to be the science of society. Freudianism, Freudian psychoanalysis, the science of the mind, and a tremendous number of otherwise very skeptical intellectuals would say, well, we're willing to believe Dr. Freud when he tells us that all of these little boys wanted to murder their fathers and marry their mothers. And the psychoanalyst would say, yes, we know this is true. We have clinical evidence. We have these people that we have psychoanalyzed. And at first they denied that they had an Oedipus complex. But after we had them on the couch 5 hours a week for 5 years, telling them that they had one, at the end of it they acknowledged that they did. And so we have clinical evidence which establishes that this is the case. Now, so the question I would, now both Freudianism and Marxism have lost their scientific pretensions, and the people continue to believe in them is really the imaginative appeal. And the question that I really am putting at the end of my book is Darwinism that kind of science, as opposed to the kind of science designing an airplane, the kind of science that's based on repeatable experiments that you can do over and over again and find out if it's really true. Well, of course, I conclude that it is. Darwin, Marx, and Freud were the great intellectual influences on the 20th century. And they were all science of the same type. You don't have to take my word for that. If you have an evolutionary biology course here at Penn, it's very possible that they use one of the 2 leading textbooks on the subject by Professor Douglas Batuma of State University of New York at Stony Brook, who said, it says in the opening chapter of his book, introducing the subject to students, Darwin did for biology what Freud did for the mind and Marx for society, which is to say, he outlined a total materialistic program and backed it up as scientific. And that was the proud boast. Poor Professor Batuma had not realized at the time he wrote that, I think, in 1986, that Marx and Freud had lost so much of their cachet. And what is common to all of these sciences is, again, I've developed at much greater length in the book, is the process of taking an idea as true because it has tremendous appeal to the imagination, because it tells you what you think ought to be true. It seems so appealing. And then viewing the evidence, as those psychoanalysts did with their patients, and selecting what you see there that fits your preconceived theory and then believing it's the truth. So I conclude that whatever evolutionary biologists may want to do or not want to do as a professional matter, there is no great reason for those of us outside that community to regard the claims that purely naturalistic processes have been demonstrated that can do all this work of creating as true. They are not established. If in fact there is such a purely materialistic and naturalistic process, it has yet to be discovered, and I suspect never will be discovered, although who can say that for sure. Therefore, we should put aside this notion, which is so widely proclaimed as fact throughout the university, that somehow naturalistic science has proved that you can do all the creating of the wonders of the biological world, including ourselves, without the need to have something involved that goes beyond that process. Well, that's where I'll leave my part of the presentation, and at this point I'd be very glad to take questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I'd like to raise a couple of questions. One is your definition of evolution, he says it's an guided process.
It's a non-guided.
Unguided.
Unguided, yeah.
Non-guided process. He also says it's a gradual process. Is that correct? In recent literature, scientific literature over the last 10, 15 years, there's been quite a considerable controversy over this idea of a gradual evolutionary process. Many evolutionists, many people, biologists, are of the opinion that evolution occurs in spurts and occurs abruptly as opposed to a gradual process.
Do you want me to respond to that at this point? The question, for those of you, in case those of you who didn't hear it, is that he says that literature indicates that there are many evolutionists who claim that they regard the process as occurring in spurts or abruptly rather than gradually. That's a restatement of what you just said. Actually, this is, I think, a somewhat misleading picture. Let me expand on it a bit to explain why. I indicated in my lecture that from the start, Darwin was pressed by T.H. Huxley and others to allow for some jumps. Now, the big reason why you had to allow for some jumps, in the opinion of the people that took this position, there are really two things. One was that it didn't seem that you could imagine advantageous intermediate forms in between some things and some other things. And an example that's easy to see is that if the theory is true, the whale is supposed to have evolved from a small four-footed land creature. And if you would try to imagine the intermediate steps of the legs becoming fins and the big tail and so on, you could see the thing in between sea and land and so on may have a lot of serious problems in surviving. So that was one problem, and that's repeated, just ad infinitum throughout the record. But the other problem is this problem that I indicated of the fossil record. Things appear fully formed suddenly. You do not see the gradual process of development of one thing from another. Now, because of this feature, from Darwin's time to the present, there have been particularly paleontologists, fossil people, who have proposed systems of evolution to make them consistent with the fossil record. And the example that you probably have in mind, the most famous recent example, is the punctuated equilibrium theory of Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. Now, when Gould and Eldredge proposed this idea that things stay pretty much the same for long periods of time and then evolution occurs suddenly and in spurts, and in small isolated populations, just a few creatures, you see. So that's why it never got fossilized, you see. The evolving all occurred off stage, as it were, in these small numbers of creatures and very rapidly. It sounded to many people as if they were proposing an evolution by jumps. But if they did that, they would be on the horns of the other dilemma. And they make this clear, by the way, in their own writings on this, that they had to avoid, in the end, they had to avoid this problem, which is the one, again, I already indicated that Darwin saw so clearly from the beginning. It won't do to say that you changed one thing into another kind of thing by a one-generation leap, because you don't have a mechanism that can do that and produce all the integrated changes, you see. Now you're talking about something that doesn't have a natural mechanism to account for it. It seems to be evoking a miracle, a virtual miracle. So that when Gould was faced with that, and Eldredge, what it turned out that they meant was that, well, geological time, a short time, a burst could mean 100,000 years or several 100,000 years. That's the amount of time in which that isolated population was evolving into something totally different. And in fact, it was evolving by Darwin's mechanism of descent with modification, step by step, one generation at a time, gradually. Only it happened in such a brief period of time, such as 100,000 years, that no fossils remain. So you see, in the end, they had to go back, and Gould has now emphasized again and again. He says, I don't know how we ever got misunderstood in this. Punctuated equilibrium was Darwinist all along. So you see, it was gradual, in the sense that while the change was occurring, it was step-by-step gradual. It's just that the periods of no change were much longer.
That's a concept many people have difficulty coming to grasp with, is geological time. How species...
Well, I'm just showing you, I do come to it, guys.
Yes. I've heard many people espouse the creationist viewpoint, and this find it difficult to grasp that concept. Geological time covers a vast period of time. So a short, broad period is 100 million years.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah. But of course, one cannot cover all the difficulties by saying there was a lot of time available. you've still got a mechanism, and however much time you've got, that has to be adequate to do it, and that's the question. And there are two ways. I mean, one has to have, in my view, for a truly scientific theory, experimental evidence, which indicates the probability that the thing can do it. And then the other kind of evidence is historical evidence, the fossil evidence, that is to say, which indicates that it probably happened that way, or at least could have happened that way. And both kinds of evidence have to be viewed without a bias in favor of the theory that you're testing. Yeah?
Yes, sir. You were spoken about non-material entities or whatever, the scientific community not accepting that. And I understand the danger in that. But as a scientist, whatever, myself, I'm wondering how would you, if you were to tell me something non-material exists, the first thing I would say was prove it, show it. How would you tell me that? Do you give me that historical and experimental evidence that you talk about?
Yes. Well, now, it isn't, to my mind, a question of proving that something non-material exists. I mean, what we start with is that we know that we exist. Now the question is, do we know how we exist or what created us? So now we can put the burden of proof anywhere you want. So you can, if somebody wants to say, well, we were created by something non-material, you can say, well, prove that that non-material exists. You can't do it, so as far as proof goes, you go. But then somebody said, well, therefore we were created by this naturalistic, material process. Oh, wait a minute, not so fast. You proved that that can do that. And so it may well be a stalemate, and that nobody can really prove anything, at least by the kinds of evidence which are done through scientific investigation. Now, there's one distinction. I think it's of crucial importance to this, and if some people have trouble understanding geological time, as they do, as the gentleman rightly pointed out, I think this is a distinction that a lot of scientists have a lot of trouble getting, in my opinion. And that is the distinction between a methodological limitation and a dogma. Let me explain to you what I mean. Many people will say, and I think quite legitimately so, that science is limited to the material and the natural. It can't study the immaterial, the non-natural, and so on. Well, that's fine. But then, of course, what that means is that it can't make conclusions about that one way or the other. Now, the problem with that is that one wants to make conclusions about it. You say, one wants to say that the non-material didn't have anything to do with the process of creation because the material and the natural did it all. So what one tends to do that is one makes a very powerful assumption that nothing but the material and the natural can ever have an effect in the natural world. This is naturalistic philosophy. Now, to say that nothing but the material and natural can have any effect in the world is to say something very powerful about the non-natural and non-material. It's to say either that it doesn't exist, or that it's, it never does anything, so it might as well not exist. Another way of putting this same point, I think, if you have any trouble seeing that, there's just another way around of putting the same kind of consideration. Let's say, you know how that game is? You have to start with the answer, and you ask, what is the question? Jeffrey, is that? Yeah. The answer is 9W, what is the question? Remember, you begin your name with a V, Mr. Wagner. If we play that game here, we'll say the answer is neo-Darwinism is correct, is true. Now, Darwinistic evolution is true. Now, what's the question? Is the question, how did we get here? How did we come to be formed? Or is the question, assuming that God had nothing to do with it, that nothing supernatural had anything to do with it, nothing non-material and non-natural had anything to do with it, then what is the best speculative guess that the science of our age has managed to make about how the thing might have been done? You see, then that's the question. Now, if that's the question, of course, then to a lot of people, while it may be the true answer, it's the true answer to a not very impressive question. Because the question assumes out all of the things that they really most want to know. And so the thing can be the best speculative guess that anybody's made in our time. Our time going back to 1859, but it may be quite false. So that's another way of putting the question. And indeed, if one took seriously the notion that science isn't going to deal with non-material, the supernatural at all, then the domain of science would really be limited. Because I have to say, we can't really say anything and say that it's true. We can just say that, you know, making all these assumptions, it might be. I mean, that's not what we want to do. You wouldn't get as much, it wouldn't be as attractive when you presented to Congress in funding proposals, for example. If you didn't say, what we're really doing is uncovering what's real and what's true. So I'll get to apologists. Let me get this one.
Yeah, in this like seemingly pro-superhuman being stance, I think that something that's important to note is that us as humans, our survival, I think, can be enhanced by believing in some form of transcendence of material. And I think that we as humans can either, number one, address this question and come up with a positive response to
zero. It's a positive entropy. That means everything has a higher probability if it is more, if it has less order. So for me that was always a problem, and isn't there a big discrepancy between evolution and that law of entropy? Shouldn't there be a net entropy?
There's much argument about this, and it's a question of physics, which is really, you know, even more outside the scope of what I have a right to talk about. I will nonetheless try to say I'm not as an the second law of thermodynamics, or the entropy principle, you know, so essentially it's like clocks run down rather than up. You have to wind them up in order to get them into a high state of ordered energy. And one of the common objections to evolutionary theory, which is always denounced as ridiculous by the official establishment, is that the whole process violates the second law of thermodynamics of increasing entropy. And in response to that, it's always pointed out that you can have an increase in ordered energy, that is a decrease in entropy, which means an increase in the order of the energy, in one part of this of a system, provided that it's compensated for by a net increase in entropy somewhere else. So the claim is that the Earth is taking in energy from the sun, and this balances the accounts, as it were. There's a breakdown of the order of energy in the sun that compensates for the buildup of order on the Earth. This assuming that this process of evolution, by the way, is occurring, but then the argument goes it wouldn't violate the second law. Now, whether or not this is related to the second law or to a different point, it seems to me, and again, many commentators have pointed this out, including quite a number from official science, from establishment science, this is no far-out position, that this leaves something out of the equation, just simply to say that. Because, as one of the people put it, you could have the sun shining on a junkyard for centuries, and all it produces is warm junk. It doesn't cause the pieces to come together into an airplane. And that is, you need something, but you need more than energy inflow. You need a way of organizing the energy inflow. Another common statement about this, again, from the establishment side, is you get this increase in order, decrease in entropy, every time you see the baby grow from fertilized embryo into an adult human being. You see, there's a tremendous buildup. But there again, of course, the important thing is that you have the organizing system in the information which is contained in the genetic program in that baby's genes, which is passed down from the parent. And without that, the decrease in entropy, the increase in order, doesn't occur. So the question then becomes, what is there in the Earth that can do this with, let us say, inert chemicals that don't have genetic information in them to make them into an ordered system? Is there something or isn't there? Well, there's a whole branch of science right now which attempts to do computer models of how an evolutionary process could work. Many of the scientists in this, many of them are physicists and mathematicians rather than biologists. And they tend to place very little emphasis on natural selection, or even to prove the whole idea. And they simply claim that, based on, I think, very inadequate evidence, and many people share that view, that nature simply has these self-ordering principles which cause order to arise without you having to have natural selection involved in it. And that you can model this on a computer by making all the right assumptions, of course, and show things getting more and more complex all the time. Now, you know, I'm simply, from a layman's point of view, and I'd be glad to be better educated on this than some who are better informed, if the second law of thermodynamics is consistent with the existence of self-ordering systems that create more and more complexity, a decrease in entropy all the time, in any system which is open to energy flowing in from the outside, then it seems to me the second law isn't a very interesting law. Because I don't see what important application it has anyway. Because, you know, other than the universe as a whole. So I'm left with that problem, if that's the explanation.
But,
do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that would have, if you say that's not important, the second law of thermodynamics, that would have influences now on physics, coming from...
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as I say, Science Magazine did an article last year on this research that I've just referred to into the computer modeling of the sort of evolution of complex systems through, you know, self-ordering systems. And what all of the biologists said was, well, this will be an interesting thing if they can ever connect it to the real world by experimental evidence, but that remains to be done. And as I read their literature, what they're doing, you see, the reason why they assume that these systems must exist, they're lifting themselves by their own bootstraps. They're saying, we're here, and we wouldn't be if they didn't exist. You say life wouldn't exist if there weren't this tendency of things to order themselves into more complex forms. That is not the only evidence, but but the evidence that they have is, you know, it has to do with ordering of such a minor nature that doesn't seem to be carried the point. And that's what you know, my reflection on it. If, as I say, I'm always glad to be better educated on any of these topics if anyone can do that. I saw your hand back in the red shirt.
Yes, I was curious, what ordering principle would be necessary for snowflakes? There you have a local decrease in entropy. It doesn't seem to me that any supernatural ordering principle is involved in that.
Yeah, that's right. There's a whole literature on this. The people who take roughly the same, you know, general line that I do, but that are much better informed in the chemistry and physics of the, you know, precise questions which you're answering are Charles Saxon, Walter Bradley, and Roger, I think it is Olson, in their book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, which goes into these questions in great detail. And
thermodynamics isn't a mystery. I mean, since snowflakes are a mystery,
yeah, but snowflakes are not biological cells either. What you have is the same thing doing itself over and over again. It's like, you know, getting a book that has the same letter or the same word repeated over and over again throughout the book. And the question is that the same kind of system that can get you the plays of Shakespeare?
So the laws of the pipe of water don't necessarily work on carbon?
I didn't say that at all. I didn't say anything like that. I said the question is what kind of self-ordering systems are they, and whether they present the kind of specified complexity that's required. And that's very much undemonstrated. That's what the snowflakes and the crystals are what I had in mind as to the other evidence besides the assumption that life was produced, which, however, is just not ordering of the, you know, of the kind of magnitude required to do this sort of job. And it doesn't get more and more so. It just does the same thing over and over again. Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, you said that one of the things that that proves that Darwinism was a pseudoscience was that you don't get reproducibility that physics and chemistry do with regards to their experiments?
Well, no, I would not have said and did not say, and I would not say that made it pseudoscience, because in judging, I mean, you know, something you have to take account of the realities of the problem that they've got. You can't make unreasonable demands. Now, even at best, however, without going into pseudo, in the eyes of its leading practitioners, this is a point that Steve Gould makes often, that evolutionary biology, you know, he calls it a historical science, because it deals with unique and unrepeatable events of the past, rather than things which, you know, you can test by reproducible experiments in the present. Now that may be perfectly genuine, I mean perfectly legitimate to do as best you can research into unique events of the past, but it doesn't mean that you can do it by as reliable a means as you can test something like somebody's claim to have invented cold fusion in the present. Yeah.
But however, I mean the past 50 years or so, there have been very few, not very few, but a few cases where evolution was induced by humans. For example, the effect of penicillin on, say, gonorrhea, or the effect of DDT on various pests that develop resistance to the drugs when exposed to them.
I'm glad you make that point, because that's going to take me right back to one of the beginning points. What is evolution? And how does the meaning of this word change? Now, there's no question at all in my mind, or in the mind of any of the people that I'm associated with in raising questions about that evolution happens in the sense in which you meant it, if that's what you mean by evolution. Now, that's the important thing, is the meaning of the word. Now, no one disputes that bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics and insects to insecticide. No one disputes that you get all these breeds of dogs. The question is this the same process that produces bacteria in the first place, writ small? Or not? That is, can you extrapolate it to get the great creative powers that are necessary to produce everything? And that's the point that I went into at the beginning. Not only is it not established that you can, but in fact, the evidence is decidedly to the contrary. The change that you get is of limited types within the type, and the variation runs out before you run out of the time. After all, bacteria are supposed to have changed very little from, as far as anyone can tell, from their original appearance 3.8 billion years ago on the Earth. The fruit fly. Pierre Grasset was president of the French Academy, one of the world's best-known zoologists, who poo-pooed all of the claims of Darwinism. And he said, the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, the pet insect of the geneticists. This is what they do all our experiments on at very fast generation times. They've made the drop wings and do multiple legs and all that. Is itself hardly changed at all since the most ancient times. And so once you look at the question with an open mind, I think there is no good reason to believe that these microprocesses can legitimately be expanded to describe the creative process that produced all of these things in the first place. Now that load is carried not by scientific evidence, but by a trick of semantics, because we use the word evolution. Evolution means small changes within the type of the example I used, the same type as yours was the peppered moth case, that we call that evolution. We use the same word to describe the process that we imagine to have made life in the first place, and to have produced humans and fruit flies and peppered moths and trees and all of those things. So when you say, well, we've demonstrated that you evolved resistance to insecticides, well, that's evolution. We've proved evolution. And we know what evolution is. It's this whole grand process. So instead of carefully looking at the evidence, we get carried away by what I think I would call semantic inflation in the value of the word. So I say that we ought not to make that assumption. The word is misleading when it's used, so you see, with both such narrow and such broad meanings. It's like an accordion. It can be narrowed or expanded at will. So there's no question that the small-scale change to the type you're describing is perfect.
What would it take you to believe in Darwin and evolution?
Oh, a great question. And this is one I put throughout the book, in effect. What would it take for me to believe in Darwinian evolution? It seems to me the theory what one would have found is two things. First was a test which T.H. Huxley set right at the beginning. He said, I accept Darwin's theory provisionally. He said, but I think, this is subject to my belief that it will prove to be true that you can produce new animal species by selective breeding. Now, in fact, that was never made, at least in any unambiguous case, that while you can produce considerable variation within the type, and dogs or whatever, all dogs are biochemically interfertile and are, by that definition, in a single species. I don't think producing a new species would be enough. I disagree with Huxley in that, because a species is just a separated breeding community. What you really want is clear evidence that it can produce major innovation. But what would convince me would be if the process of change appeared to be continuing steadily in various directions, you see, so that, after all, we've had 130 years to test it, so that you could have some good reason for thinking it would continue as long as there was time available. It's the fact that the change stops long before the time stops that makes me unconvinced. So that's, you know, it's a proof along the same order of what Huxley specified, and which was never produced. But I would have, you know, in fact, required a bit more than Huxley stated. I'd be a little harder to convince. The second thing is this, is with respect to the fossils. And this is a question I asked directly in the book. Suppose that it's 1859, and suppose that you are a fair-minded, intelligent reader of The Origin of Species. And you know that Darwin is opposed, not just by some clergymen, but by all the leading fossil experts of his day, which he acknowledged to be the case. You can read that in The Origin and check that out. Among the leading opponents of Darwin's system was Professor Louis Agassiz, the most prominent natural historian in the world at Harvard. Agassiz said it was all wrong, it couldn't happen that way. Now suppose that you're reading this and you want to be fair to both Darwin and Agassiz. This is the question that I put. And you know that Darwin in The Origin says the fossil record is incomplete. It's against me, but it's not fatal because Darwin said, we haven't explored enough fossil beds. We haven't known what to look for. Well then, what would you predict would be the case after 130 years of fossil exploration by thousands and thousands of paleontologists who are almost all dedicated Darwinists, desiring very much to establish the theory? Well, it seems to me what you would expect to find, as hundreds of times, you know, of fossil beds that were explored, manifold increase in information, you get hundreds of millions of fossils by now that are discovered, you would expect that the fossil record would look a lot more Darwinian than it did in 1859. That knowing what to look for and doing all that exploration, they would find lots of examples of things that appeared to be transitionals, documenting a transition from one kind of thing to another. You wouldn't expect to find it in every case. You'd expect a lot to be missing because, you know, fossilization is a sometime thing and all of that. But you would expect that the problem would be getting better all the time. Now, in about 1975 or so, Professor David Ralph of the University of Chicago, and the world's leading paleontologist, wrote a statement that's much quoted. He said, in fact, it's getting worse all the time. That we have fewer fossil intermediates than we had. He said in Darwin's time, but I think it would have been, he probably really meant a few decades after Darwin's time, when many successes were claimed. And they have turned out to be unsubstantiated. So, in fact, that was what necessitated the punctuated equilibrium episode. Was that in the 1970s, looking at it again, after more than a century of attempts to confirm the theory, what did you see? You saw things coming into the record suddenly, and then you saw them staying fundamentally unchanged. The stasis is much more important than the sudden appearance, because you can always explain the sudden appearance by saying, well, the transitionals were there, but they didn't get recorded. They once existed, but they didn't get fossilized. The stasis is positively documented. Things that were here hundreds of millions of years ago, until they went extinct, or if they're still here until today, stay fundamentally as they were. And that's the stasis. Now, supposedly, their cousins were, the cousins of the coelacanth, a living fossil fish, close cousins were supposedly evolving into amphibians and reptiles and then people, eventually at the end of it, while these ones stayed fundamentally the same. So that's why I'm not convinced, and of course what would convince me would be if, as you would expect with a true theory, if the paleontologists kept saying, Eureka! We wouldn't have known that what this was, but now we can see what it is, and if they found again and again the kinds of things that the people whose existence the theory would predict. That's the answer. That's what would convince me.
Are you aware of how the today's paleontologists deal with this lack of fossil evidence? You mentioned one.
Yeah. How they deal about the fossil evidence thing? They're all over the place on this. The best known paleontologists, the ones best known to the general public, are people like David Rauch, like Stephen Jay Gould, Mike Niles Eldridge, and Stephen Stanley, because they've done books for the general reader, and they are very prominent scientists as well. And these are all people who acknowledge, pretty frankly, the non-Darwinian character of the fossil record and its appearance, and then who have, have proposed hypotheses of the punctuated equilibrium variety and genetic mechanisms involving changes in the genes that regulate embryonic development, and it might create, big changes with a simple beginning or something. But they acknowledge, that is to say, they think something drastic, fairly drastic, has to be done to modify Darwinian theory, to add to it in some way to make it consistent with the fossils. But I don't think that those people are necessarily typical of the great mass of paleontologists out there, as I gather from conversations, from other reading. And a lot just are simply content to say that we never expected that the fossil record would do anything more than show that evolution, whatever that might mean, has occurred. That new things have appeared, and that they're more or less related to what went in the past, and the fossil record is so poor that you just shouldn't expect it to show anything. Now, that's a position that one can take, but of course it leaves me with, well, how do we know that it happened? But that's how I'd summarize my understanding of it. But there's so much different, one of the things I've taken an interest in recently, I've just written a little short paper about, is the mass extinctions, and reviewing the book. The guy who wrote this book, David Rauch, who I mentioned before, wrote a book a few years ago called The Nemesis Affair, about a theory that there are periodic mass extinctions caused by asteroids that circle a distant star and so on. But in that book, he reported a poll that was taken at a meeting of the American Geological Society, where they had all the geologists and the paleontologists together. And it was hilarious to read. Because it was something like, 27% thought that there was an extinction at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, that mass extinction was caused by an asteroid. And 19.5% thought that there was a mass extinction, but it wasn't caused by an asteroid. And 22.75% thought that there was an asteroid, but no mass extinction. And the rest thought the question was meaningless, but it was a kind of spread that you would get if you asked the American public a question about flying saucers or something. And it indicated that there was nothing remotely approaching, a consensus on some fairly broad things we were going through. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was going to let her follow up.
This is actually a very general question. You can decline if you want. You've raised a lot of interesting issues and questions, and I guess my sense is that you've sort of thrown them out for our thinking. If you had someone who was particularly interested in pursuing it, what would your suggestion be in terms of, not specifically, or maybe specifically,
I mean, besides reading my book.
You're not suggesting that this is all your own work. I mean, you would made a book out of readings from other people and in your own thinking, and saying, here you have an audience. Somebody says, I'd like to resolve this question for myself. What would your advice be?
Oh, you mean to do the work themselves? Well, that's what I tried to make it very practical to do from the book, because besides the chapters of text, I have the chapters in the back of the book of research notes, which are a guide to the reading that I did, and which, are, I don't say a complete guide to the literature, because that would be really oppressive and excessive, but a very substantial sampling of the literature that anyone could follow. It's not at all impossible to do, because so much of it appears, even the professional literature, the stuff that's done for other scientists, the bulk of the stuff that's really of interest to the non-specialist, appears in two journals, Nature, which is the leading British scientific journal, and Science, the leading American scientific journal. And most of that stuff is written for general scientists, you see, who are lay people with respect to any specialty other than their own. So it's quite readable. And so it's not at all difficult to follow, even the stuff that the scientific profession is following. And there's a lot of books about it for the general reader. Now the problem is that the books for the general reader are almost entirely written by people who are trying to sell the theory. And that they're saying you should believe, you should believe. And then there's the literature, which is actually hard to get a hold of, from the creation science people, who have their angle. from the kind of approach that I am taking, there are about 4, I think, books, but 3 besides my own that I think are particularly significant. One is Michael Denton's Evolution of Theory in Crisis, and taking the same roughly general view that I do. Faxon, Bradley, and Olson's The Mystery of Life's Origin, which deals with chemical origin, is a little tough for a non-chemist. It's really a bit more than for the general reader, but it's quite good. And a lawyer predecessor of mine, Norman Macbeth's Darwin Retried, which is a very witty and charming book that sort of pokes a little fun at the theory and is I think, quite soundly reasoned. So those are the books I think would recommend it, the ones that take my kind of view. Then, you know, Gould, if you want to get the official science point of view of the stuff by Gould and Dawkins in particular. And I highly recommend Doug Fatuma's book, which is a real, you know, I'm slam bang make the case for the official theory. Does a good job of marshalling the evidence. Yes?
I don't really have a question. I have a couple comments, and I don't necessarily solicit a reply. One is about the business about stasis.